I would like to welcome everybody and say good evening. I don't know what the weather was like where you were today, but here in Fairfax, it was quite snowy. So we got probably about 10 inches at my house. So we're doing our continuing look into the Indigenous heritage of the refuge. So thank you for being a part of that. My name is Julie Filiberti, and I'm a current board member for the Friends of Missisquoi. And the Friends of Missisquoi is who is bringing you this presentation tonight. So our Friends organization is there to support the refuge in whatever way we can. And one of the ways we support the refuge is by presenting events like this to bring public awareness to the refuge. We try to do both fun and educational presentations, and hopefully that's what you're here for tonight. So in addition to bringing our audience information on the flora and fauna, we've made a commitment to give people the opportunity to connect with the cultural heritage of the refuge. And one of our avenues of doing that is to again welcome Dr. Fred Wiseman to share his knowledge of this particular piece of Indigenous history. Continuing to make such events like these free for the public is very important to us. And the Friends do not actively fundraise, so all of our revenue to support the refuge comes either from memberships or from donations. And in virtual events such as these, we can't really put out our usual little donation jar to solicit donations. So if you're able and want to ensure that presentations like this can continue, you can go to our website and you can either become a member or you can give a donation there. The most beneficial way that you can support us is actually becoming a Friends member. And if you share our appreciation for the refuge and want to support it, it's really the best thing that you can do. There's different levels that you can join, whatever suits you, but it puts you in contact with us, that we can share a newsletter, you're on our email list, and we can keep you up to date of what is happening at the refuge. There on our website, we also have the donate button. So if becoming a member isn't really for you right at this moment, you just want to give a donation, it helps. So every little bit helps. When we put those all together, it allows us to bring events like this to you. So I'm going to thank you in advance for your support. Before I turn the event over to Fred, I would like to go ahead and honor the Abenaki by reading our land acknowledgement. So the lands and the waters of the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge are very special places to those who make it their home. And we, as the current stewards of this area, recognize our responsibilities in caring for these lands and waters. We recognize that these lands and waters are also important to the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi, the previous caretakers of this land. We are grateful to them and their ancestors for caring for this land and its surrounding waters for thousands of years. We understand the importance of this land in the Indigenous heritage of the region and to the Abenaki present and past. We recognize the hardships and suffering these families endured when they were pushed out of their traditional ancestral lands as European colonization took hold. And we acknowledge their agony and despair when their access to the Delta for subsistence was ended by the creation of this wildlife refuge. We invite our visitors to share in honoring this Abenaki home by engaging in mindfulness while enjoying the refuge lands and waters, and by holding the space with care and appreciation. Thank you. So I think we're ready, Fred. I'm going to let you introduce yourself in case we have some audience members that haven't been present for any of your other presentations, and I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to just talk for a second before I call up the PowerPoint. Um, to talk for a little bit about what this class is going to be about. Heretofore, most of my classes have been using kind of a native perspective about hunting and fishing and other more specific types of information about the wildlife refuge. This time, I wanted to change the focus just a little bit. I want to back out from a strictly Indigenous Abenaki perspective, and I want to back out a little bit from strictly Vermont to give kind of I guess you could say, a popular version of a college course that I have taught probably for 25 years in different places, including Louisiana State University, MIT, Johnson State College, and other organizations, including the Vermont Center for Integrated Herbalism and other places. And so this is going to be on ethnobotany. And ethnobotany is a very specific discipline. It's a subdivision of botany, or it could also be thought of as a subdivision of anthropology. But what ethnobotany is, it deals with the interactions between human beings and plants. And there's 100 ways of looking at it, and there's 100 ways of teaching it. So what I'm going to do is try to teach it from my perspective as a professional that's been engaged in ethnobotany with many publications, ranging from material here in the Northeast to the Sierra Madre, Mexico, in Guatemala, and the Southwestern United States. So I'll call up, let me hit share screen. And I'll get the ethnobotany introduction up. And then the slideshow. Okay, so I hope you can all see the screen. So this is a introduction to North American Indigenous Ethnobotany, and by North America, that includes all the way to the Panama Canal, not just the United States. Some of the material we're going to be looking at extends into the Canadian Maritimes. A little bit of it is going to extend in the Northwest coast, up the Pacific coast, and quite a bit of it is going to be in northwestern Mexico, and also a touch here and there with Guatemala. So this is the introductory section. This is one of the Vermont Indigenous Heritage Center presentations, with, of course, the support of the Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge. I always like to start these talks with kind of a recognition that there is an Indigenous American knowledge base that is represented by this woman over here, Our Lady of Knowledge. This is a image by a Huichol person that talks about the interaction of, I guess you could say, herbal spiritualists and the greater cosmos. And the symbology here is very complex, but it's in many ways very simple. The next lecture we're going to be dealing with is indigenous ethnobotanical spirituality. And we're going to talk a lot more about this lady and how she has her hand holding her heart and has the God's eye interacting with the cosmos. So I just always like to start with this lady here because she's kind of the patron of the way that I think about ethnobotany. So this is a kind of a simple definition of ethnobotany on the screen. It documents, describes and explains. Now, each of those is different. Ethnobotany documents things. In other words, it talks to people. It goes into the field. It examines agricultural plots, participates in archaeological digs. I'm going to show you a little bit of that from my experience over the years. It also describes, in other words, it tries to standardize this information in ways that people can understand. And so that's why we use scientific names for a lot of the different plants that are used, and we standardize the names of the different tribes that will be using these things. So we have to establish kind of a what we call a standardized nomenclature, and explains. Now this explanation is where it gets hairy. There's a couple ways of thinking about this. The first is kind of a ecological or scientific explanation, and that generally involves kind of systems, the way that cultural systems interact with environmental, ecological, or community ecosystems and stuff like that. And you get in the weeds pretty literally, pretty deeply in that. But explanation also, we can move out back from that a little bit and look at it from maybe a 50,000 foot distance above, and show how that you've got human interaction spheres interacting with plant communities, but the explanations of the ways that they interact is kind of complex. In other words, there's a discipline called concentric ecology that is a way of explaining this, and one we're going to be using that that explains that human beings and the plant world relate to each other as kin, as if they were in a family. Perhaps some of you heard of the term all my relations. That kind of explains it. But concentric ecology says that it's not just a one-way street. In other words, we don't have responsibility for plants, but plants also have a reciprocal responsibility to us. There's another allied philosophy called relational accountability that basically takes that up a notch. That says that a scholar is not only accountable for the plants that they're interacting with or studying, but also the ecosystem, the ethnobotanist tools, the indigenous people whose land she or he is on, and even the spirits of that particular area. And so it deals with management, yes, and down at the bottom, I list includes food, clothing, currency, ritual, and everything else. But we have to also remember that relational accountability says as we extract material from the ecosystem, we're also patterning ourselves on the ecosystem. And so that is one of the ways that we're going to look at things. Now, every class that you ever have on, any discipline always talks about the history of it. And so this is my quick and dirty history of ethnobotany. It really began in North America in the 1600s. And many of the Spanish conquistadors and the early English explorers and French explorers would collect plants and bring them back to either Madrid or Barcelona or Paris and London. And bringing these back, then they were put in royal botanical gardens or established and put in gardens. And this was considered kind of a way of certifying that you've taken over an area when you bring the plants back and begin landscaping with them. And so the idea is that there was a big competition between the colonial powers. Who's collected the most stuff, the most species? Who has the biggest botanical garden? Who has the most publications in botany? So we're not going to be talking much about that at all. Beginning then in the 1840s to the 1940s, that's Indiana Jones time. And I think Indiana Jones explains a ethnobotanist a lot more than an archaeologist in terms of going into the jungle, being shot at, and things like that. Every ethnobotanist has really amazing stories that lived during that time period. So the idea here is that all primitive societies were disappearing. The plant ecosystems are all going away. So you've got to discover them, you got to salvage them. And once again, the idea is that the colonial or Euro-American had the best solution to this whole problem, which is instead of collecting them, put them in the gardens, what you did is you took a plant press and you pressed them and brought them and put them back in a university herbarium. The time period that I came on the scene was at the tail end of classical ethnobotanists. Um, so this was when people really started being interested in describing the interaction of human beings and the landscape. This started with actually going and talking to indigenous people, asking them about their ways they raise plants. But during that period, you never really asked them too much about what they thought of the plants or any spirituality or ceremony or ritual associated with it. So if you see books of that time period, it'll give you a scientific name, and then it'll give maybe 10 or 15 possible uses of it by whatever group it is, and maybe three indigenous names, and that's it. Domestication, that was another big thing. People were in mostly Carl Sauer and his group over at the University of California, Berkeley, got into how people domesticated plants and the idea of diffusion of agriculture throughout the world. When I was doing my PhD work, I was in this period of explanatory ethnobotany. I got big into mathematical modeling, paleoethnobotany. A lot of my friends were really interested in psychopharmaceuticals, and there's big money in going out and finding plants that could be brought back and used in curing. One of the most famous of this was Dioscarea elephantipes that was used by shamans to help with fertility control. That was the original source of some of the earliest discoveries in pregnancy prevention pills. And so a lot of other discoveries came out of that idea. And there was the people that were interested in looking for these drugs and working with the shamans. They were the ones that really got the cash. I can remember most of us, we had basically paid our own way out, and then you'd have somebody that would have, hundreds of thousands of dollars, stayed in good motels, had large entourages. So it was kind of I was always very jealous, but that's not what I was interested in. 2000, we started with human experiential ethnobotany. In other words, what does this mean to people? How do various types of societal roles, gender, work to interact with plants, and separating them out by childhood, gender roles, hierarchical positions. How is a warrior, let's say, using plants differently than a shaman or a healer or a tribal leader? Another big thing at this time was working with the media. This is well before Netflix, but oh my God, back in the 2000, there were huge numbers of Nova things on television and things like that, and so the media really became enamored with ethnobotany because it was really exciting, interesting, and kind of weird. Another aspect of it was decolonization, trying to figure out how to give back to the indigenous people. In other words, the ethnobotanist is ally rather than exploiter. And that's kind of where I've been at for the last 30 years. And where we are right now in the 2010s and later is applied ethnobotany. And we're dealing with cultural and ecological justice and advocacy. For example, there's a controversy here in Vermont about how much traditional ethnographic knowledge remains in the Abenaki community. And is this borrowed from other people? And so a lot of my current work in ethnobotany and my more recent publications have been focusing on documenting this type of information that is local, ancestral, and not borrowed from any place else. And so, but this is kind of strange because as soon as we get into this, you leave science behind. Because classical science, of course, is supposed to be non-political and not have an advocacy or not take a position on anything. Because if you do, the old idea was that you'd uh, start believing in what you think was happening. And this is something called confirmation bias. There's one of the big problems that we have in junk science right now. Instead of trying to discover things, you come up with a idea and then try to prove it after the fact. This makes good for good forensics, but very poor science. And so that kind of started with climate science about 20 years ago. And more recently, of course, we've had a lot of the politicization of vaccines and the COVID and things like that. And so this combination of media being able to find somebody that is willing to go along with it, whatever position that person, the media does, they are able to select those scientists. And so it's very confused now. So where does truth lie? Uh, so, so I admit to, working on the material to make a case for the local cultural competency of Vermont's indigenous people. But I am using hard data. Okay. There's just a few examples of this in the old days. This is Richard Evans Schultes. I knew him toward the end of his career when I was at MIT as a young Turk, and he was the old Grand Master. And here he is back in the post World War II era, working in the Amazon. He was the guy that really got that kind of scholastic drug culture stuff on going out and figuring out something that indigenous people are taking that makes them have an interesting alternate reality type of an experience, and then working to try to figure out how that is and what it does. And my gosh, back in the 1970s with Don Juan and the New Age and all that stuff, boy, ethnobotany became a hot ticket, and he was kind of he never really indulged exactly in that kind of advocacy, but he was almost worshipped by all the kind of botanical hippies and the ayahuasca and peyote people back in the day. So I wanted you to see a picture of Richard Evans Schultes. For those of you that back in the day tried anything from mushrooms to more interesting stuff, this is the guy. Another important aspect of this was kind of the Indiana Jones-ish ethnobotany. And this is my friend Barney Burns, who passed a few years ago, and me in Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. We were working with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research to take cores from these beams. There's one up here, one of the Vegas, to be able to figure out the when this particular structure here was built by dating tree rings. Now, this is one of the more scientific or esoteric branches of ethnobotany. So I dabbled in tree ring dating, dendrochronology for a while. And so this is me in the field back in the day. Here's a rundown of the types. We first talked about the evolution of it. These are kind of the ones that you have today. Paleoethnobotany, this is people and plants in the distant past. That was what my PhD was in. Right now, I'm doing historical ethnobotany, working on the relations of people and plants in recent times using written documents. I also dabble and did dabble a little bit in theoretical ethnobotany. And this was the domestication and development of civilization. When I was at LSU, I taught advanced graduate courses in New World domestication. And when I was at MIT, I did advanced seminars in the technology. And I'll actually show you my old lab at MIT with the totally obsolete looking equipment. Oh my God, how times changed. Ethnographic ethnobotany is what I do a lot of right now, talking with modern Indigenous Vermonters. And a few years ago, as you'll see in some of the slides, when I was working in the Sierra Madre, I visited, hung out a lot with Indigenous people there. And especially the next lecture, when we talk about ethnobotanical spirituality, I'm going to go into the weeds a little bit in that. Applied. This is what I talked about with discovering medicines and industrial types of materials and things like that. And finding those out in traditional societies, and then bringing this information back and seeing if some of those chemicals can be synthesized or those technologies can be converted into modern, modern use. And so every now and then, I know I've trained the algorithms on Google, to give me in my feed stuff, but it seems like there's always something coming out on some new invention that actually was originally developed, hundreds of thousands of years ago, or was newly discovered being used by indigenous people. Forensic ethnobotany, we're going to touch on that, is using ethnobotany in court proceedings. And when I was at MIT, I did a lot of that. And it was very interesting and it really trained me a lot in very strict ways of understanding and using science. And for example, I was able to find out where a person who is dumped in, let's say, the Charles River, where they were with their last breath, because you could sample the mucus in the lungs of a person who had passed, send the sample over to me, I would extract the pollen and say, oh yeah, they were in the middle of a garden, or that person died in spring when this mix of flowers and trees was in bloom. I also was able to take scrapings off of people's boots, stuff like that, and tell the kind of ecosystems that they were in. That was a lot of, it was really interesting. And it was tough because if you were working for the prosecution, the defense would hire one of your friends to say that everything that you had come up with was a bunch of bucksnort. So it was, so you'd be with another ethnobotanist that they hired. And then after the you left the courthouse, you'd often go out and have dinner together because there was nothing personal in any of this. So here's some examples of this is a midden right here in the front. This is an excavation in a small archaeological site in the middle of a savanna in northern Guatemala in La Libertad. And so everybody was out looking for artifacts. I was always taking samples for botanical remains. And it was amazing. You think about how destructive the tropics can be in terms of rotten stuff, but there was some areas in these that were so poisoned by mercury. Okay, there was used was a red color from cinnabar called vermilion that sterilized everything. You had great uh, preservation. The only problem is that you had because not only did it kill the bugs in there, but it also kill you or drive you insane. Mattis Hatter, remember from mercury poisoning of people working in the felt industry. And so you had to be super careful. The better your preservation was, the more in danger you were. But there's other things that had greases and oils that would preserve things. So it's really fascinating story. And when we get into some of that, I'll tell you some fun stories, okay? Ah, yes, lab work. Isn't that nice to see everybody smiling? So this is flotation. So what you do is after you've taken one of the middens, you basically put the material in water. And if all else works, the organic material will float to the surface, or at least you can put it in kind of this big swirly gadget that keeps it from settling. And so only the heavier stuff will settle to the bottom. And so then you put different types of filters and things like that. This is a millipore filter here that the lab assistant is using. And this will filter the material out. And then you take that and you will bang it on a big open piece of butcher paper or paper towel. And then you dry it very carefully. And then you can put it under the scope and look at it. And then you got to figure out what the seeds are, what the buds are. Oh boy, that was always, I hated flotation analysis. There it is. Yay. So I ran a fairly large uh, laboratory for environmental work in the Center for Materials Research and Archaeology and Ethnology, one of the foremost most institutions in the world on this kind of stuff. And over here, these are all the different types of equipment for examining lipids, different types of oils, microimmunological work, so that you can actually get a pot, take a scraping, and using microimmunology, you could tell whether this was a deer or a rabbit or even a whale that was in the material that you had collected. And look at the old time computer screens there. Boy, it's really dated. And everything is all square and blue. Styles have really changed. It's kind of embarrassing, but that's what I grew up in. Now all you've got is this stuff hooked onto your cell phone. Beep, and there it is. Another important thing is our getting the ethnobotanists to actually learn with indigenous people. And so these are some colleagues that are studying with one of the women that specializes in basketry and actually working with them at an archaeological site. This is a really handy thing. A lot of the big archaeological sites out west have a very close relationship with their indigenous neighbors. And this provides an outlet for teaching. And this is always a wonderful thing. So when I used to run field trips out there, I would always find what Beshpagawa or Canyon de Chelly or what was going on and who are the people that were doing the teaching, and get my students all over and just hang out with them for a day or two. But my main love of ethnobotany was the Sonoran bioregion. This is an area that extends up to about uh, just north of Phoenix and all the way south through northern state of Sinaloa, from the Gulf of California and the Nevada, California boundary out west, and the top or height of the Sierra Madre. And this is young Fred Wiseman here with my hat. I still have the hat. That's my Indiana Jones equivalent, long sideburns of the period, talking with Arturo and Benigno, figuring out, we got a map there, figuring out where we're going to go out into the woods. And here's an older, weaker, and wiser Fred Wiseman in 2017. Uh, Still going there, and I intend to go out at least with one of you, hopefully more, back to the Sierra and visit Indigenous people this this April, and we'll hope to be visiting a Yaqui Easter. We have a large cadre of interesting, weird people. Here they all are. Uh, that's me right there with the fig, with my Sherlock Holmes hat on, big smile, and let's head south. So I was a ringleader of this group that was called the THEL, or Tropical Honkies Expeditionary League. The group of graduate students we would just throw together and head out for the tropics on weekends, settle into a small village and interact with the locals and have an absolutely wonderful time. And I'll be telling you some of my the after I get to know you a little better, I'll tell you uh, some interesting stories. This is a map of where my work was done in the Sierra Madre. So basically, if from up in Arizona, with the Tohono O'odham, also called the Papago, all the way down uh, into Sinaloa. Unfortunately, much of this territory now is the home of the cartels. And it was when I was working, that was starting. But it's exceedingly dangerous, and I'll tell you some stories about that. So most of this area is pretty much closed to modern exploration, and some of the um, I don't know. It's a very sad story of what's happened in this area. But we'll go back before darkness set in. This is a shot of what the tropical deciduous forest looks like. It's a mixture of cactuses of various types. Almost everything there has thorns on it, but it's the most wonderful and highly spiritual place I've ever been in the entire world. You can almost hear uh, the forest singing to you. But there's a lot of culture here. You'll just look at a hillside and you'll notice a whole bunch of these terraces. These are called las trincheras, which means terrace in Spanish, duh. And these are built to channel the small amount of runoff during the rainy season onto these platforms. And once it overflows the top platform, it goes a second platform down, third, fourth, fifth, and you can see all the way down. So what you can do is you plant the most mesophytic, or the ones that require the most moisture, higher up, and the ones that are going to be drier will be farther down. It's a really fascinating system, and you had a large population of fairly advanced semi-civilizations there. One of my favorites is are the different pueblos. Now these are Mogollon pueblos are totally different from what you'll see up around Flagstaff and in Colorado and stuff like that. They're only very loosely related in terms of the ceramics and everything else. But nevertheless, it's still an adobe and adobe mortar and rock structure, but they're very different. In other words, up north, anybody's ever been to the Pueblos up there, this is a distinctly northern Mesoamerican or Mexican style of granary. You put your corn in there and you sealed it up tight by putting mortar over these little windows that you could load it up. So really interesting stuff. And boy, to get to that is quite the drive and quite the hike. So they're in pristine, absolutely pristine condition. Another is working with indigenous people. This is an old Yaqui or Yoeme house. And it's called a ramada. Maybe you're familiar with Ramada Inn. This is a cooling structure here that nevertheless is open on the sides to let cooling breezes to go through with these portable mats here that can be placed appropriately to shield from the sun, but yet allow the wind through. And interestingly, this type of technology is being used by avant-garde drylands architects today. So that's where some of this applied ethnobotany comes. This is a modern Yaqui shrine. And you'll notice this is a shrine to the ancestors. And we'll talk a little bit about this. And it has both deer that have been shot by the ancestors that we're dealing with. It also has various types of plants up here and foodstuffs and food grinders and things like this. And this is maintained. Some people maintain it all the time because this is where you invite the ancestors to come in and hang out and have a meal with you. The Abenakis up here do a very derivative, small scale version of this. And interestingly, if you trace what we call as a little ancestors dish or bowl, when you have a ceremonial meal, everybody takes a bit of the food, puts it in a bowl, takes it out, puts it on the north side of a tree. This is a small ghost of the complexity that you get when the closer that you get to the heart of North American ethnobotany. And we're about 3/4 of the way there when we get to Magdalena, Sonora. I learned a lot. This is one of my great mentors. This is Juanita Ahil, Tohono O'odham lady. She became quite famous and actually figured in a couple documentaries. And I had a wonderful relationship, but she always called me Frady. Frady, you got to do. And so she really had me well trained. For example, when I used to take my students out, we'd hang out with Juanita and, oh, Brady, I need some. So I ended up sending my students out to get food or she needed more material to make baskets. So we'd go up to the higher elevations where you could get yucca and bear grass and stuff like that. And so we had a wonderful relationship that she shared with me and my students, but boy, she had us running. So I have many fond memories of Juanita. Great lady. I've got all kinds of stories. This is a fascinating thing. This was not my picture because when I was here, uh, I felt very uncomfortable with sharing this. This is a portal, uh, and it's got a lot of kind of proprietary stuff going on here. You can see it's associated with the Day of the Dead. A little bit you can notice. And for those of you that think the old religions and stuff like that are long gone, nope. Uh, I was very lucky once I got access to one of these portal shrines here. But I want you to notice all the food that's being set out here. Okay, if you can imagine, I used to use popular culture reference when I used to teach this back in the day, and this is when Stargate science fiction show was on, and the way I kind of explained this, so just bear with me and go watch Stargate afterwards. On Stargate, if you want to open a portal to get to some other planet, you had to actually dial it in. Uh, by using electronics and stuff like that. The analogy here is that you set the dial by the crops and the prayers that are given. So depending on what you want, Apuch, the main deity here, that is working with you to deal with whatever you need to have dealt with, you program it dependent on the offerings and the prayers that are given. So it's kind of interesting little thing. And when we talk about botanical spirituality, we'll go to the margins of what we can talk about with this one. But it's these people here. These are the deer dancers and Pascola dancers of the Sierra Madre. These are the people that took me under their wing and really taught me the underlying structure of the ways of understanding the world. We've got several young men who are Pascola dancers who are in training here, an older gentleman here, and a father that's looking at these young men just with great pride. And I was able to sit and learn many things along with them back in the day. And so a lot of these things interact specifically with the ecosystem in ways that once I started working up here in Vermont, a lot of stuff that didn't make sense to a lot of other people with this kind of knowledge here, I was able to find enough analogs to start figuring it out. One of these is the concept of the call. Now, let's just say we've got a young Abenaki dancer. He wants to learn how to do a ceremony or something like that. Basically, what we do here is you get a teacher and you teach. Nope, that's not the way it's done, actually. Um, and I've written it up this way here. When a young dancer is chosen by the spirits, the medicine people issue a call. The call resounds through the villages, the carvers, clothing makers, the shell and feather workers' heart can listen, and amplifying its force and its urgency. And then the call drifts out over the field, forest, river, hill, mountain, and meadow, echo from other places. And the plants, the animals, and the birds take note. And the old covenants, original agreements between human beings and the ecosystem, are recalled, and the land knows what to do. So that's what we do up here, but we have just forgot this. Okay. So it's this type of thing that is still operational in many parts of North America that probably were operational here within the last 100 years, but because of a lot of stress, these have been rethought a little bit. And what I'm trying to do is use these old knowledges to restructure and recall the underlying covenants that are universal throughout actually all of the world. This is graphing it out. So on the right hand side, you have the officials that are doing the ceremony. And so each of these require a sacrament. So you see the blue arrow up on the top. The call goes that way. So the officials need a color guard. The color guard needs eagle staffs. The eagle staffs require people to make it. And to make the eagle staff, you needed a beaded panel that a bead worker needs to create. You need trade silver. You need feathers. You need the ash tree for the shaft. Uh, and all of this stuff then comes back, is put together by the staff maker, ends up with the eagle staff that's given a color guard that's then used in the ceremony. So if you're going to be a singer, you got to have a drum maker. You require the ash for the frame and the drum, for the drum head and the lacing. The astronomer to set the date and the time. You need to know the solar lunar calendar. If you're going to build a fire, kindling firewood, wampum, rattles, all of that. So you can see operationally, even here, that call goes out. And you end up somebody, if you're going to, have a dance bustle, somebody's going to have to interact with the birds, even if it's just buying turkey feathers from Crazy Crow. So that's the way that we can think about this with that 50,000 foot view, I guess you could say. Okay, so I'm going to leave that behind now and get on back to, I guess you could say, the more or less the nuts and bolts of ethnobotany. So it has a whole series of different things. You always, when you take a class, you've got method theory. Okay, method theory has paradigms, methodologies, techniques, and skills. And if you want to become an ethnobotanist or dabble in it, at whatever level, you're going to have to think about different types of paradigms. And so a lot of these we've already talked about under the theoretical. Okay. The methodologies, though, these are very simple, but very distinct. So, for example, optimization theory. This is the basic underlying methodology that is used by ethnobotanists. It's called OFT, or optimal foraging theory. It was originally developed for animal studies, but then was applied to the collection of plants. Since this is an introduction, I'm not going to go into what that is, because we're actually going to have a maybe 20-minute discussion of it this semester. Dialectical materialism, big fancy term that deals with the functional views of plants. In other words, dialectical materialism talks about the functions. There's three functions of an object. This would be a plant in this case. One is utility. What's it used for? The second is social patterning. How does that reinforce how the person using it thinks about themselves and their position in society? For example, in me with material culture, I always wear a bolo tie when I'm lecturing, and each one of these bolo ties expresses a different facies or a different aspect of who I am. And the third is symbolic, and this is how an object transmits high order cultural values and ideals such as patriotism or religious devotion. Okay. Environmental psychology. Okay, this deals with the aesthetics of things. In other words, one of the big interesting puzzles is, why do some people hate the taste of something and love the other people love it or hate the smell of it, or some animal grosses them out or not. So uh, the aesthetical and environmental psychology of these things. How do people, do people like going to the forest, or does it freak them out? And if it freaks them out, why? Uh, Even the amount of sunlight coming through a canopy is important. And you see that all the time in especially old masters paintings or landscapes of the 17th and 18th century. These are all manipulated very carefully to express feelings. So you show an old master's image of, somebody riding a horse in the middle of a field, show that to a European, they would interpret it completely different than a person from Central America. Then forensic methodologies. This is discovering evidence and then using that for applied purposes. So we talked about forensics, like me finding out where a person had been by the pollen in their lungs when they passed. That's one form of it, but it also is using this evidence can be used in something called heritage forensics. So there's a big debate right now on tropical forests. Should they be managed or should they be completely left alone? So ethnobotanists are able to go and actually study the way that indigenous people use the forest to establish standards. And I did that years ago with the interesting development of agroforestry in the Maya area, which is now, after I published all the original documents, articles and books and stuff on that back in the 70s, it's now become in, since people are dealing with agroforestry and climate change. And so there's real cash associated with it. So here I am stuck up in Vermont, whereas if I would have been at MIT, I could probably pull in $1 million grants with no trouble at all. Oh, well. Okay, techniques and skills. Interview and care of informants. That is a real skill. Boy, some people don't know how to treat their informants. Oh my God. And really pisses off whole villages. I know a couple ethnobotanists that actually got almost rode out of a village on a rail because they just wanted to know, why somebody had a bowl of something sitting out. And it not for you to know. What do you mean it's not for me to know? It's sitting right there. You got to be careful. Plant collection, documentation, or burying work. This is the boring part of it. Get your plant press. There's all kinds of protocols on pressing plants, taking the information. Now you can't just, got to get the GPS data and all of this kind of stuff. And now everybody has all of this information for collection on your cell phone. Yes, there is an app for that. I don't have it on my cell phone. I refuse to. So I'm a Luddite on that. And I don't have to anymore. Okay. Let's see. Plant systematics and technology and taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of classifying living beings. Gets in the weeds. It's a very disciplined discipline, very heavily scientific. There are virtually no jobs in it at all. But it's very necessary. And the most important aspect of this is saving seeds in case, climate change and things like that. So there is a certain amount of stuff on VPR and Vermont Public Television about seed banks and things like that. And that's where all the plant systematics come. Sampling theory, mathematics, how to collect information to determine, let's just say you want to figure out what a average field is in the Sierra Madre. How many of these fields are you going to sample to be able to figure out how you can make a generalized statement about the distribution of different cultivars up and down the sides of mountains, going from tribal homeland to tribal homeland, doing all this kind of mathematical modeling. That used to be big mainframe computer stuff back in my day. Today, it's on your cell phone. What I'm trying to get back into a little bit up here is microscope and lab procedures. So, for example, I'm going to be doing a microscope intensive analysis of Abenaki beadwork at the Vermont Historical Society coming up on the second Saturday of February. And so I've been busting my butt. I've now got 10 good stereo microscopes that can be used for ethnobotanical work as well as material culture work. But we're going to break ground on with beadwork. But I'm hoping within the next few months to be able to start having ethnobotany labs. And I hope to be able, when it warms up, to bring my scopes up, and we'll set an array of them up at the Wildlife Refuge, and we'll take a look at stuff. Proper responsibility to your subjects. And these are both the plants that are your subjects, as well as the human beings and their needs and wants. And this gets us into the realm of ethics and proper protocols like prior informed consent, do no harm, stuff like that. So these are a lot of the things that if you were going to take this class as a real college level course with homework, books to read, textbooks, blah, blah, and stuff like that, this would consume about 2 weeks of intensive work. My classes at MIT, I used to have to assign, this was set by the college, okay, 500 pages of outside reading a week. And this is for students that were engineers that were just taking this class to fill an interest or a requirement. Can you imagine? These people have electrical engineering labs, 12-hour labs, maybe 4 times a week. And then have to read 500 pages for me. When I was at Johnson, I couldn't get people to read 20 pages a week. It's amazing. And now that I teach Abenaki studies, I don't even make any assignments. I just teach this as edutainment to hopefully get people interested enough to start delving into it on their own. And then they can start going into the nuts and bolts of it. And then, maybe later I could come on again as a faculty advisor. Interestingly enough, my last student was a student in ethnobotany at Concordia University up in Canada. It was a few years ago. But then another thing that's very important as we're transitioning to our area here is that Native America is all one large community. Okay. If you think like a colonizer, you're going to break everybody up into individual cultures. Like, oh, you're in Missisquoi territory. Oops, that's different than Mohegan territory, which is entirely different from that from Penobscot territory. But they're all Wabanakis. That's completely different from the Iroquois. And the Iroquois is still part of the northeastern woodlands cultural area. And that's completely different from the southeast. Well, that's not really true. And so that's another stereotype that ethnobotany breaks down, is you got to get away from this idea of classification and taxonomy. Okay. Another issue we have to deal with right now, because we're all very much so dealing with uh, racial social justice and constructivism and things like that. This is a quote a few years ago by Michelle Hegeman. Uh, and one of the things is experiential ethnobotany. In other words, get people out, having them do it. How did they feel about it? How much effort was it? How much work did children, women do into grinding, in this case, grinding into meal? Well, get out there and grind it yourself. See how you like that. And so a couple years ago, when we were working a lot at the Ethan Allen Homestead, we did a huge amount of experiential ethnobotany, and we generated a huge amount of information that still awaits publishing. Now, this is a graph that I did a few years ago that shows the evidence, the durable evidence. So you've got, it goes in all different directions. So you can start with the field, and this is the evidence of the fields. And on the fields, what do you have? You got plants. Okay. From that, these are the macrofossils, residues, the kind of information showed you earlier. Okay, when I do a flotation and talking about the grease and the cinnabar and stuff, and that generates food, and that gives you all this kind of information. Here, modern foodways, experimental ethnography. For example, right now, I've got a colleague, Joanne, who is taking this class, is working on a cookbook with me. And she is doing the experimental ethnography, getting these old recipes that were written down in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and cooking them up and seeing how they taste. And some of them taste good and some are terrible. Okay. So we're in the throes of still doing that right now. Then that generates humans, and then that comes over. Humans do ritual, and there's the ritual artifact. This is very important part, and only recently is being really studied a lot by ethnobotanists. Still a lot of ethnobotanists do descriptive ethnobotany and even don't even get close to this. But I find this is where the fun is. And then domestic architecture, you got to have a place to live, and that gives you all kinds of uh, archaeological and other forms of information. So you can get all of these things, bring them together, and then turn this back, make all the arrows go this direction, and you can figure out what the humans were doing, what they were eating, what the crops look like, and what the fields look like, and what the rituals look like. And so this is a very important way of thinking about things. Now, getting the word out. Now, we're not quite there yet, but we were approaching this down at the Ethan Allen Homestead a few years ago, but then we had kind of a political upheaval, and a lot of the political stuff that's going on now in Vermont is with Abenaki legitimacy, blah blah, stuff like that, is really dampening this down. But most every place else has a lot of these large scale gatherings. And so this is a good example, contemporary ethnobotany, where you've got different professors and types of tradition bearers and stuff like that getting together, doing field trips and stuff. I'm hoping that over time, maybe we can lay the groundworks at the wildlife refuge for beginning to approach something of this scale. Again, we've got many good colleagues of Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. ECHO is very much into the ecological aspects of this. The Vermont Historical Society a few years ago did a whole exhibit on cropping, Abenaki cropping. So I think there's a lot of potential for doing things like this. ECHO used to have a potluck with local foods, And it was really good. Now we need to think about scholarship now. And this tends to be the way that information flows. Okay, so the public relies on the teacher, me, to teach them about that. The teacher relies on the researcher, also me, that relies on extracting information from the subjects. Now, the public gives money and privilege to the teacher. So, in other words, when I was at Johnson, they paid for my medical, uh, and all my benefits, my retirement, uh, because I taught the students and the public. And you get pretty famous there for a while. Back in the day, when I was doing a lot of work with the Rise of Maya civilization, I had a pretty good reputation as an innovator, world-class innovator back in the day. Then also there's money that flows, not so much to the teacher, but certainly to the researcher. And a lot of my work, traveling, especially in Guatemala and the Sierra Madre, came out of grants. You notice nothing goes to the subject. So this is a extractive model that everybody sucks information from indigenous people and makes a lot of prestige, cash from it. So needless to say, until maybe about 20 years ago, that was the model. It still, in some places, is the model. This is the way that I try to do it. Okay, so the public. This is how I taught at Johnson. So I would force all of my students into doing research projects and making objects that would help the Vermont Abenakis or the Passamaquoddies. So what I used to do before every semester is I'd write the Passamaquoddies and Penobscots and the various chiefs of the Abenakis in Vermont and the Odanak Abenakis what they wanted, material and or research done. Each of my students paid into a class, a lab fee that gave us a budget to purchase materials to force the students into making them for the different tribes. So, for example, the Circle of Courage. If you notice what they do, their Eagle dance outfit is getting a little ragged right now. Maybe they've got a new one. Somebody new has made it. And the pipe ceremony stuff. A lot of this material, over the years, we donated to the Circle of Courage group that was led by Brenda Gagne. As a teacher, I spent huge amount of times working. I did much of the historical research for the recognition petitions for many of the tribes, and that material was done gratis and still is, by the way. I'm still doing this. Is made available to the tribes. For example, in 2023, I spent probably over 3, maybe 400 hours doing research and building PowerPoint presentations for 4 all-day workshops that were designed to be given to the chiefs and the heads of the NGOs of the tribes. And those were very successful. And that was done in my retirement on my dime. So as a researcher, it became very important to both get this information back, and as a teacher, take my information and then go back, then teach it back to the community. Now we can even begin to think about taking the grants and getting them directly to the subject. So this is an old slide. And what we're working on right now is getting cash to the NGOs that can do the research. And that's when it's going to be important for people that are taking like this class, understanding the techniques and stuff that get started as indigenous people being able to do this work. Uh, as maybe in the future more grant funds will be coming in. So instead of people such as myself, we can have students doing it. I had my students at Johnson doing a lot of it. Many were Abenaki, many weren't. But that's kind of where I'm heading right now. This brings us to Seeds of Renewal. This was a project initiated right after recognition that was designed to document the cropping systems, and the ceremonies and foodways of the Wabanaki people. Wabanaki people are the Abenakis of Vermont, up at Odenak, up in Quebec, as well as the Penobscots in central Maine, Passamaquoddies in eastern Maine, Maliseets in eastern Maine, and in Nova Scotia, uh, and the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia and Quebec. So those are all the different tribes of the Wabanaki. So Seeds of Renewal dealt with all of these people. Now this becomes, in some cases, very political. Decolonizing a diet is deeper and darker than the paleo or locavore diet, because people are trying in their own way to reconnect with their food traditions, but they confront a landscape that's changed and a culture that has changed. For example, most ways that we think about food sovereignty now just means getting groceries to poor members of the community without any real thought about the underlying food traditions. So you're always fighting with colonization when you're trying to deal with this, and this leads to all kinds of, as it says here, darker things, including lateral oppression, stuff like that. And some of the problems that we face is, we're still dealing with the attempts at neutralizing the Abenakis through killing them, genocide, and ethnocide. And of course, we're still dealing with it today. Uh, Same old, same old. It just changes every 50 years. It changes a little bit, but it's still war. Always has been, and hopefully, it won't be much longer. These are the research categories, and we're going to get into a lot more detail on that. Now, it seems as though let me double check the time to see how we are doing. And okay, we're coming up on the end. So I try to keep this to about an hour and a half. So modern crops, agricultural technology. We're going to have a whole, probably 3 lectures on all of this. So we don't have to worry about introducing it. This is a 2014 harvest that was 28. We're over 50 now. Corn, beans, squash, and all kinds of other weird and interesting and beloved plants like Jerusalem artichokes and sunflowers. This is a good obsolete map of where some of these crops came from. We've got a lot more now. So I'm going to, when we get to that, I'm going to show you a much more modernized version of it. These are the weird stuff that we do. You take an old picture, here's a sunflower, and you've got to measure all of the different shapes and sizes of the leaves, and then work out an algorithm, and then test it against all kinds of modern varieties to see, is this one actually the same as this? And so this is Aunt Sarah, very famous uh, Northeast Kingdom Abenaki woman, standing in front of her sunflower patch. And these are the different kinds of seeds that come out of our work. We were talking about experiential ethnobotany. Here it is, actually raising fields, these mound systems. We're going to talk a lot more about. And harvest. I love this picture. 3 generations harvesting corn and beans and squash, uh, 3 different crops using Abenaki made knives and stored in Abenaki made baskets. Cooking, cuisine. That's kind of where I am right now, is working on a cookbook with Joanne. And bean hole cooking in bean holes, really interesting. Old earth oven technique. You find these in archaeological sites, and here we are doing a bit of experimental and experiential ethnography. Remember the old stereotypes, Indian used everything. Well, in many cases, this is actually the truth. So here's a pumpkin. You eat the seed. You use the outside as a gourd bowl, and then you dry the flesh and reconstitute it for Three Sisters soup. And then once again, a large focus on the harvest and ceremony. Here's the hunting dance with Cody out doing the hunting dance. It's a very hard dance to do. Interesting. It looks fun, but it's really difficult. I could just thinking about it makes my back hurt. I love this because when we do this, I get to put on my old lab coat from MIT days, and actually I can still fit in the darn thing. Whew. Now that I've lost a little bit of weight, I can get back in it. And of course, it's spreading the word. So here we are out in Arizona, talking with other Native nations from throughout North America, letting everybody know that the Abenakis are on the map. And this is the goal. If you want to build a restaurant, this is the menu that you can use, and that's kind of where I'm working right now, is to actually flesh this all out. So this is a sample of a lot of the recipes, and now what Joanna's doing, she's actually cooking them up uh, and seeing how they work, doing tweaks on them, and hopefully within the next year or two, we'll get a cookbook published. These are seeds of renewal crops over the Passamaquoddy. So these are now available and being used by all the other nations in the Northeast. This is a seeds of renewal field in a Penobscot example in Solon, Maine. These are some of our partners in this slide here, all in zone 4, which is a very marginal area for growing crops. Of course, with global warming, many of these are approaching zone 5 now. And where, if we really decided to go, whole hog on this, um, this is where we could get the grants for hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars. Because if you notice, this is the average variation of the polar jet that everybody's worried about with climate change. And so the interesting thing is you can see if we're on this side over here, see we're on the southern part of it, and it sucks in all of this nice warm air. And this was like last year where we didn't have any real snow and any real frost. But if we're on the colder side, oh my God. Julie just talked about all the snow that she got nailed with. And think about the low temperatures. We didn't even get below 0 in Swanton last year. And so since we're right in the middle of this, look at this, that our crops here basically will grow from Georgia to Newfoundland. So when we start thinking about environmental and climate change resiliency of crops, can you imagine what the germplasm of seasonal new crops are worth? Somebody want to make a couple $1,000,000? Interesting to think about. And so as we end, the Angakchina, asks us to listen to the song and live life to the fullest. And with that, we'll come to the end. All right, well, I will then say good night. And it was fun, and we'll be back again on the 30th, and we're going to talk about Indigenous spirituality as it pertains to plants. So I'm going to say good night, and I'm going to hit the exit button. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for joining us.